Okay, so we just got to the part where Euthyphro says that holiness is what I am doing now. But what I want to do is I want to go back to this section right here where look at what Socrates says to him. Socrates says, so this is just before Euthyphro answers that the definition of holiness is what I'm doing. Check out what Socrates says. And I, my dear friend, perceiving this, wish to become your pupil, for I know that neither this fellow Meletus nor anyone else seems to notice you at all, but he has seen through me so sharply and so easily that he has indicted me for impiety. Okay, this is a part I really want us to pay attention to. Now, in the name of Zeus, tell me what you just asserted that you knew so well. What do you say is the nature of piety and impiety, both in relation to murder and other things? Is not holiness always the same with itself in every action? And on the other hand, is not unholiness the opposite of all holiness, always the same with itself, and whatever is to be unholy possessing some one characteristic quality? Okay, so notice something. What Socrates is doing is he's trying to give Euthyphro some advice on how to start a definition. And notice how that's a very convoluted passage, is it not, right? However, it's one of these things where if we go back and we really sort of think it through slowly, right? When we come across something like this, and you're reading through the dialogue, and it's kind of in one ear and out the other, is it not? And it sounds like, oh man, this guy's just talking in circles, right? But if we stop and we figure out what he's up to, we can actually pull out some valuable stuff. Notice what he says. He says, okay, so tell me what you just knew so well. What do you say is the nature of piety and impiety? Okay, first of all, notice that we have switched. He's been using the word holy, right? So we went from holy to pious. Okay? I mean, it's subtle, but I want to, really look at the details of this. Look at the next thing he says. Then he says, in relation to murder and other things. Okay? So then he says piety in relation to murder and other things. Right? Okay? Then he says, is not holiness always the same with itself in every action? Okay. So number 3, we're going to say that holiness is same in all such actions, right? And then we've got, and is not holiness the opposite? Is not unholiness the opposite of all holiness, right? So he said, what? That holy and opposite, that is unholy, are not the same. Okay? Right? And then lastly, he says to us, and always the same with itself, and whatever is to be unholy, possessing some one characteristic or quality. Okay, so all that is unholy has one characteristic. Okay, now once we tease all this out, it might not sound quite as much like double talk, from a little while ago. But notice something. He says, okay, now remember, he says all this before he asks him the question, okay, so now tell me, what is piety? He gives him these 5 pointers on how to define it. First, notice, he switched from holy to pious. If you're reading another translation, the word godly comes up here sometimes too. But notice this is a synonym, right? And what's a synonym? A synonym is another word for the same concept, right? So, when he's talking about holy versus pious, he switched the terms in hope of allowing Euthyphro to understand the first part of trying to define something if we don't know what it is to gather up or understand what we do know about it, and perhaps we know it by another name, right? So a synonym will help us to define our term. Next, he says murder and other things. Okay, so in other words, we're talking about like a category of action, right? So in other words, let's say I'm talking about something like, cat. Well, there's like all kinds of different cats if we divide up the pie. But if we're going to understand cat, we have to understand what cat is like in the tiger and the lion and the bobcat categories, because catness is alike in all of these other examples. Does that kind of make sense? So in other words, if we're going to be talking about pious, it has to be visible in all actions that are pious. In other words, not just one. And number 3 is very similar. He's talking about the same thing. So he says, is holiness, in other words, the word we're after, not the same in all things, right? So back to this, we couldn't have, a tiger here and a wolf here, because the catness has to be the same in all of the things under which we subcategorize catness. I mean, it gets complex, right? But really, he's just asking him to think about something very logical. Number 4 might strike us as like, no doubt, right? The holy and the unholy are opposite and not the same, right? Obviously, black is not white, up is not down. Okay, got it. However, this means that we can't lead to a contradiction. Because in other words, if I define a term such that it applies to both itself and its opposite, then that can't be a definition, right? The definition has to apply to the thing that is the same in all, not the opposite in all, if that makes sense. And then lastly, he says, tell us the one characteristic that holy is. In other words, by this characteristic, another way to put this is form. And indeed, in many translations, he calls it form. And this is really the idea that we're after. What is the idea of unholy or holy, obviously, right? We do the opposite. Because there is something about catness, right? That is characteristic of all things that we're going to call cats. And so what we want to talk about is what is that overarching characteristic or form that then allows us to understand, oh, the lion is a cat, oh, the tiger is a cat, oh, the bobcat is a cat. So notice what Socrates has done, while it may sound convoluted and even like double talk, right? Our first time through a dialogue like this, if we really stop and we pay attention to what's going on, notice that Socrates has given him, basically a mini little workshop in how to define a term. And so, taking all of this information that Socrates has given to Euthyphro, then he gets definition 1, which is what I am doing now. And that's where we kind of stopped last time, right? And to prosecute wrongdoer. So he gives him an example. Now let's think about this for a minute. Is this a good definition? Well, let's set what I'm doing now aside and just look at this one, to prosecute the wrongdoer. So the deal is this holy, right? In other words, is this pious? Well, let's look at what Socrates has to say about it. He says, certainly Tell me then, would he say it's what I'm doing now? Okay, just to locate us in the text. So let's move on. Okay. And then he says, and he has proof that he can give, right? So he kind of does a little speech. Okay. But look at this. Socrates says, after Euthyphro gives him a little speech, is not this, Euthyphro, the reason why I am being prosecuted? Because, oh no, that's not what I'm after. Hang on, sorry. Okay, here's where we want to go. He says, I accept these tales, for what am I to say, who confess frankly that I know nothing about them? But tell me in the name of Zeus, the god of friendship, do you really believe these things happened? What things is he talking about? Well, go back here for a second. And Euthyphro, after he gives his definition, says, Zeus is the best and most just of the gods, and they acknowledge he put his father in bonds because he wickedly devoured his children, and he in turn mutilated his father for similar reasons. What he's talking about is Greek mythology. And in Greek mythology, if you're familiar with it, I won't go into great detail here, but in the creation story, the first male god was Uranos, who bound his children in Hades. He was afraid of them. One of his sons, Kronos, rebelled against his father, but Kronos also feared his children, so he ate them. What Euthyphro is arguing here is this. Well, if we look to religion and we look to the gods as examples of how we are supposed to behave, then yes, if I prosecute my father, I am being just like Kronos and Zeus. In other words, I have a religious role model that I could look to. Okay. That's why here Socrates says, he goes, Euthyphro, great artist, do you believe all this stuff? And Euthyphro says, not only these, but as I just said, I'll amaze you with other stories. Okay, so Euthyphro wants to talk about the gods in these crazy stories, right? But notice Socrates says, to get him back on track, I dare say, but you can tell me those things at your leisure another time. At present, tell me more clearly what I asked you just now. For you did not give me sufficient information before when I asked you what holiness was, but you told me that this was holy which you are now doing, prosecuting your father. Well, what I said is true, perhaps. But you say that many other things are holy, do you not? Why, so they are. Now call to mind that this is not what I asked you to tell me one or two of the holy acts, but to tell the essential aspect by which all holy acts are holy. Okay, what he's talking about, right, is this. If, let's say, I ask you, what is a tree? Okay, so let's say definition of tree. We're saying, well, what is a tree? All right, and you were to tell me what I have now, oak, right? So here you go. Okay, whatever. That's an oak tree, okay? There you go, oak. Now, we could say to ourselves, is that a tree? Sure it is. Well, wait. Actually, we don't know what it, not necessarily. Because we all, in the back of our minds, know about trees. Instead, let's talk about chuck-a-doo-doo. So, here's a chuck-a-doo-doo, and we're going to ask ourselves, what is chuck-a-doo-doo? Now, there is no such thing as chuck-a-doo-doo. I just made it up. But if I were to say to you, is this a chuck-a-doo-doo? Right? And I say, there it is. That's a chuck-a-doo-doo. C for chuck-a-doo-doo. Now, do you understand the definition of chuck-a-doo-doo? I mean, no. Presumably you may, recognize this as my attempt at drawing a coffee cup. But that doesn't tell you what chuck-a-doo-doo is. That is an example of chuck-a-doo-doo, which if you already know, i.e. tree, right, then you can easily say, oh yeah, I already know what tree is, so I know oak is a tree. But there are many different kinds of trees. There's palm trees, there's fir trees, right? So this is not a definition. This is just an example. So he didn't listen. Euthyphro didn't listen to what Socrates is trying to ask him.